Every economist who studied Singapore in 1965 reached the same conclusion: write it off. No oil under the ground, no minerals, not even enough rainfall to keep the taps running without help from a neighbor who already hated them. One man disagreed with the economists, and because of that disagreement, Singapore today has a higher GDP per capita than the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom. A country that had nothing built everything. This is how it happened, and more importantly, this is the man who refused to let it fail. To understand what Kuan Yew pulled off, you need to understand what Singapore actually was before he got his hands on it. For most of its existence, the island was barely a footnote, a fishing settlement sitting at the southern edge of the Malay Peninsula, quietly minding its own business while the rest of the world got on with history. That changed in 1819, when a British administrator named Stamford Raffles sailed in and spotted something nobody else had bothered to notice: geography. Pure, weaponized geography. Singapore sat exactly where the Indian Ocean met the South China Sea. Every ship moving between Europe, India, and China had to pass right through that narrow strait. Raffles did not see a swampy, malaria-ridden backwater. He saw a choke point, and choke points, historically speaking, print money. So the British built a port. Workers arrived from China, India, and the Malay Peninsula by the tens of thousands, chasing wages and opportunity. Within decades, a fishing village had become one of the crown jewels of the British Empire in Asia, a humming, multicultural trading hub that punched far above its weight and made the British extremely comfortable in the process. Then February 1942 arrived and dismantled the entire illusion in about a week. The Japanese Imperial Army had been pushing south through the Malay jungle for weeks, and the British commanders in Singapore were not particularly worried. They had artillery, big artillery, massive coastal guns pointed out to sea, loaded and ready for a naval assault that was never coming. Nobody had thought to point them the other way. The Japanese came overland through terrain that military doctrine said was impassable, and Singapore fell in what Winston Churchill would later call the single worst military catastrophe in British history. 70,000 troops surrendered. The myth of British imperial invincibility did not survive the week. The locals noticed, you cannot watch the empire that colonized you crumble in 7 days and then go back to pretending they are the natural rulers of the region. Something had shifted permanently, and the idea of independence, once considered absurd, started to sound like the only logical next step. The British returned after the war ended in 1945, apologized in the vague diplomatic way that empires apologize, and attempted to resume business as usual. It did not take. The independence movement was already building, and at the center of it was a Cambridge-educated lawyer named Kuan Yew, sharp as a blade, allergic to sentimentality, and completely consumed by a single question: how do you build a country from nothing? But before Lee could answer that question, there was a detour, a badly designed, politically explosive detour. In 1963, Singapore merged with Malaya, Sabah, and Sarawak to form the new nation of Malaysia. The logic seemed sound on paper. Singapore had the port and the financial infrastructure. Malaysia had the land, the resources, the economic depth. Together, they would be stronger. In practice, it became a slow-motion disaster. The Malaysian government operated on a framework of ethnic Malay political primacy. Kuan Yew wanted something different entirely, a Malaysia where citizenship meant citizenship regardless of race. He called it a Malaysian Malaysia. Kuala Lumpur called it a threat. Race riots broke out in Singapore in 1964. People were killed in the streets. The political relationship between Singapore's leadership and the federal government deteriorated past the point of repair. And in August 1965, the Malaysian parliament made the decision for everyone. Singapore was expelled, voted out of the country it had just joined 2 years earlier. On August the 9th, 1965, Kuan Yew sat in front of a television camera and wept. Not tears of relief, not tears of pride. He wept because he believed, with very good reason, that he had just inherited a death sentence. Take stock of what Singapore actually had that day: a population of under 2 million people spread across 280 square miles, no military to speak of, unemployment running at double digits, racial tensions still smoldering from the riots the year before, an economy almost entirely dependent on British military bases that London had already announced it was planning to close, no natural resources of any kind, not a drop of oil, not a strip of arable farmland, not even enough fresh water to sustain the population without importing it from Malaysia, the country that had just thrown them out. If a management consultant had been handed Singapore's balance sheet in 1965, they would have recommended liquidation. Kuan Yew was not a management consultant. He was something rarer and more dangerous, a man who had identified the one asset Singapore actually possessed and had already started building a plan around it. That asset was location. The same geography Raffles had spotted in 1819 was still there, still functioning, still funneling the world's shipping through a narrow corridor of water that Singapore sat directly beside. If Lee could make Singapore the most efficient, most trustworthy, most business-friendly port and financial center in the entire region, the ships would keep coming. Capital would follow the ships. Jobs would follow the capital. It was a thin thread to hang a nation on. But it was the only thread available, so Lee grabbed it with both hands. The problems were immediate and stacked on top of each other like a structural disaster waiting to happen. Water first. Singapore imported the majority of its fresh water from Malaysia through a pipeline agreement that could be cancelled the moment Kuala Lumpur decided it was politically convenient. Lee understood that any country which cannot guarantee its own water supply cannot guarantee its own survival. He ordered reservoirs built across every available stretch of land. He mandated that rooftops across the island be designed to collect rainfall. He invested in desalination research at a time when turning seawater into drinking water at scale was considered somewhere between optimistic and delusional. He did not care. The technology needed to exist, so Singapore would build it. Today, Singapore's New Water program recycles and purifies water so effectively that the country has largely broken its dependence on imported supply. What was once an existential vulnerability became, over decades, a model that other water-stressed nations fly in engineers to study. Then, the economy. The strategy most newly independent developing nations followed in the 1960s was economic nationalism. Build walls, keep foreign companies out, develop local industry behind protective tariffs, and become self-sufficient. Kuan Yew looked at that approach and ruled it out immediately. Singapore was too small to be self-sufficient. It had no raw materials, no captive domestic market large enough to sustain industry, no agricultural sector. Trying to wall itself off from the world would not protect Singapore. It would starve it. So Lee did the opposite. He dismantled the barriers, slashed corporate tax rates, invested heavily in the rule of law, and sent his ministers to court foreign multinationals personally. He was offering something rare: a Southeast Asian city where contracts were enforced, courts were not corrupt, bureaucracy was efficient, and your regional headquarters would not be nationalized the moment a new government came to power. The manufacturers, the banks, the trading houses all looked at the region and asked the same question. If we are going to have a presence in Asia, where is the one place we know our money is safe? The answer kept pointing to the same dot on the map. Housing was next, and it was the problem that most directly touched the daily lives of ordinary Singaporeans. In 1965, the majority of the population was crammed into overcrowded slums, wooden kampung settlements, and urban tenements that were fire traps in the dry season and disease vectors in the wet one. Lee established the Housing Development Board and gave it a mandate that would have sounded like fiction anywhere else: house the entire population in a generation. The HDB began constructing public apartment blocks at a pace that outran almost every comparable program in history. But the clever mechanism underneath it all was ownership. Singapore introduced the Central Provident Fund, a mandatory savings system where a portion of every worker's wages was set aside and could be used to purchase their HDB flat. They were not renting from the state, they were buying from it. By the 1980s, more than 80% of Singapore's population lived in public housing they personally owned. Think about what that does to a society. When people own the place they live in, they have a material stake in whether the country around them succeeds or collapses. Social stability became built into the architecture. Education followed the same iron logic. If Singapore had no natural resources, then the population was the resource. Every single person had to be educated, retrained if necessary, and equipped to participate in a knowledge economy. Lee standardized English as the language of instruction across all schools, a decision that made him enemies in communities who saw it as cultural erasure. He was not trying to erase culture. He was trying to make every Singaporean child capable of doing business with London, New York, and Tokyo without needing a translator. Students were taught their mother tongue alongside English. They graduated bilingual into a world that would pay a premium for exactly that skill. Within a generation, Singapore's literacy rate went from a genuine crisis to one of the highest on the planet. Defense was the final foundational problem, and in some ways the most existential. Singapore in 1965 had no real army. Malaysia sat directly to the north. Indonesia, under the mercurial Sukarno, sat to the south, and had spent the previous years in an active policy of confrontation toward the region. Lee reached out to the Israelis, who had their own considerable experience in building a military from scratch, while surrounded by larger and hostile neighbors. Israeli advisors quietly arrived in Singapore and began the work. National service became mandatory for every able-bodied male citizen. 2 years of military training. No exceptions. Lee was explicit about the philosophy. Singapore could not match its neighbors in size or resources, but it could make the cost of attacking it high enough that no rational actor would consider it worth the price. The Singapore Armed Forces today operate advanced fighter jets, submarines, and a level of military sophistication that is wildly disproportionate to the country's physical size. That is entirely the point. By the 1970s, the numbers were moving in the right direction. Foreign investment was arriving faster than the government had infrastructure to absorb it. The port was expanding. New manufacturing sectors were taking root. GDP growth was running at rates that made regional economists do double takes. By the 1990s, Singapore's income per head had surpassed Britain's. The country that had colonized Singapore for a century and a half was now poorer, on average, than the people it had governed. Let that land for a moment. None of this came without cost, and it would be dishonest to gloss over it. Kuan Yew ran Singapore with an authoritarian grip that made Western liberal democracies deeply uncomfortable. The press was tightly controlled, political opposition was methodically neutered, chewing gum was banned, vandalism carried corporal punishment. Lee did not apologize for any of it. His position was blunt. Social order was not the enemy of prosperity, it was the precondition for it. You could have freedom of speech, or you could have a functioning economy in a country with no resources and hostile neighbors. He was not interested in the experiment of finding out what happened if you tried for both simultaneously. Whether that bargain was worth striking is a question that Singaporeans continue to debate, and it is not a simple one. What is not debatable is the outcome. Kuan Yew died in March 2015 at the age of 91. Queues stretched for hours outside the building where his body lay in state. People who had grown up in the slums he had cleared, educated in the schools he had built, employed in the industries he had attracted, stood in the rain to pay their respects. Whatever history ultimately decides about his methods, the city rising behind those queues was his answer to every critic. 50 years earlier, a man sat in front of a camera and cried because he thought his country was already dead. He spent the next 5 decades proving himself wrong, problem by problem, policy by policy, one uncompromising decision at a time. Singapore was not supposed to survive. It was too small, too poor, too isolated, too divided, with too many enemies and too few friends. It survived anyway. And the next time someone tells you that a problem is too big, too complicated, or simply impossible, it is worth remembering that Singapore was supposed to be impossible too.